Welcome, everybody, to the Lion Zone, where you learn to be a lion and not the prey in a world of hungry jackals and vicious wolves. I'm your host, Steve Johann. For more about me, visit stevejohann.com. Find me on Substack under stevejohann.substack.com. I've got another great show lined up for you. And yes, it's been a while since I've had a show. I've been busy and did some traveling, and now I'm back in the office again, lining up some great guests. We have a great guest for you today. And I normally start things out with music to set the pace for, set a theme. But I've decided I'm not doing that because YouTube always says, hey, no monetization, even though I don't have that many followers. I don't want to not get monetized at all. So we're going to forego the normal song. And I'm going to introduce my guest. Today's guest is Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army retired, Jeffrey N. F. Adicott. Is full professor of law and the director of the Warrior Defense Project at St. Mary's University School of Law, San Antonio, Texas. He's currently serving there, an active duty officer or Army officer in the Judge Advocate General's Corps for 20 years. Professor Adicott spent a quarter of his career as a senior legal advisor to the United States Army Special Forces. The reason I invited Jeff on is to discuss his research into the war between the states, specifically his book, Union Terror, Debunking the Justifications for the Union's Use of Terrorism Against Southern Civilians. But we will also be discussing the use of terror in general by opposing forces in their attempt to diminish and devalue their opponents. But before we do, I want to ask you a little bit about your project. The Warrior Defense Project, but tell me a little bit about yourself, Jeff. How did you go from a kid and decide you wanted to make a career out of being in the military? And then how that led into your Warrior Defense program?
Well, I guess you've heard the old idiom, an apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And I guess that's true in my case. My relatives, I guess, on my mother's side came over on the Mayflower. And so we've been involved in every war that the United States has been involved in, from George Washington's army all the way up until modern times. My dad was a World War II veteran in the Korean War as well, and in Vietnam. So he served 30 years in the Navy, and I, had that as my background, growing up as a Navy brat, I guess. So went to a lot of different military installations, familiar with those types of things. Familiar with the stories from my kinfolk about this war, that war, and so and so fought here in World War II and World War One, and the American Civil War and Revolutionary War and stuff like that. So, but like all good red-blooded American males, I really wasn't that interested in going into a peacetime army. I was more of in the mind that if we're at war, yeah, I'd like to go in and do that. So I went to law school. And when I was in law school, my last third year, there was an Army recruiter there at the law school looking around, trying to get people to join the JAG Corps, which is the Judge Advocate Generals, which means you're a lawyer in the Army. I really had no interest in doing that. But after talking to the recruiter, I made a couple of conditions and said, yeah, I'll join if you, send me to Berlin or to Vincenza. So I'm single, might as well see the world. It's only a 3-year commitment, get a little military experience. So bottom line, I did join. I did 2 years in Berlin, enjoyed the heck out of it. And I had 1 year left to go. So I called up headquarters and said, hey, for the last year, would you send me to Korea? They said, sure. I said, well, on the way, could you send me to airborne school at Fort Benning? They said, yeah. So I got to Korea. I was the senior lawyer at Camp Humphreys, and went through the Korean Ranger School, just kind of on the side, volunteered, did that. And then my time was up, but I enjoyed the military so much that I decided, I kind of like this. Stayed for 20 years. I became a senior legal advisor for all the Green Berets. I was assigned to 1st Special Forces Group, deployed on 4 combat operations during my tenure in the military. And as I said, I was the senior legal advisor to all the Green Berets in the world. Worked in the Pentagon. I taught at our JAG school. So I got to do the lawyer part, but I also got to do the warrior part. It's a lot of fun. So I did operational law, did terrorism law in the real world. And when I retired, I always wanted to teach. I like to teach, and became a law professor, moved to Texas. And so Been doing that ever since. Right after 9/11, I retired in 2000. 9/11 occurred, and I had written a book for the Army War College a year before, predicting in Chapter 8 that Al Qaeda was going to attack us in the homeland. And I went into detail about the organization of Osama bin Laden. So when that occurred, they were looking around for talking heads in a lot of different places, and I was a natural fit because I'm a law professor, uh, you know, uh, senior advisor to all the Green Berets, special ops. And so I got on Fox News, MSNBC, CNN. I did over 5,000 interviews, um,
Wow.
and worked very closely with the Bush administration. I stood up a center called the Center for Terrorism Law to study all the legal issues associated with terrorism. Went to Guantanamo Bay, uh, met President Bush 3 or 4 times, testified before the Senate on legal issues related to the war on terror, testified before the House. I've done 3 amicus briefs to the Supreme Court. And then on the side, I also started representing soldiers that were wrongfully accused of misconduct. I've represented about 150 soldiers. So after President Trump crushed ISIS, the war on terror kind of took a back seat. So we formed the Warrior Defense Project to concentrate on my other mission of helping soldiers. And I've been doing that now for the last 5 years. And we don't charge any money. And I basically never lose. So I do that, and I've done about 150 cases already, maybe near 200. A lot of them made front page national news. Some of the cases I've done: Green Berets charged with murder for shooting the enemy in combat, rules of engagement violators, all sorts of stuff. So I'm doing that right now full time. I teach full time as a law professor. Well, my specialty is national security law, terrorism law. I've written several books on terrorism issues, and that's where I kind of am right now.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, I got your resume and I was like, oh, this is going to be an interesting interview. And so I got interested in the war between the states. I never even gave it much thought, to be honest, until a few years ago when I just started reading revisionist history and just doing some research and interviewed a couple people on my show already. Um, but it was when I was travels through the Southeast that my mind really became quickened. First, we did a road trip, my family and I. We flew out and then traveled around the northern New York and up through Boston and around all the historical places where all the wars were fought and the War of Independence.
Yep.
And then I started thinking about, okay, what was going on during that time and things, and learning about people like Roger Williams, the guy that founded Rhode Island, and his views. And then we did another trip where we flew into North Carolina and came across, and we came all the way down and did all the southern states. So we stopped at a lot of these little townships or little fields where there would be markers, and we did research. We went to the Battle of Vicksburg. We stayed in the Duff Green Mansion, which is there in Vicksburg. It's the only remaining one of two, I think, remaining buildings left after the North came in and literally leveled that whole township. The whole city was leveled. And I have a picture of all the mud and the dirt, and the only thing standing. And the reason why is the owner converted it into a hospital and said, Union soldiers at the top, Confederate in the second level, and we're at the bottom. If you want to shell your own men, go ahead. And so then all of a sudden it became a neutral zone. And I learned a lot, and we did a lot of traveling, and I've done a lot of research, and I realized it wasn't the war that I was taught in high school, that there's a lot more to this war than I haven't even imagined. I'm just scratching the surface now. But I realized it was a scorched earth. It was a Roman style of warfare, of literally salting the earth, burning everything, scorching everything. Outlaw Josie Wales may have a little more clear picture of what the war was about than a lot of other wars, but it got me thinking. And I've been on a search of finding authors like yourself who have researched what did take place, what actually did take place, what was going on in the mind of the commanders, what was going on in the mind of the politicians at that time, and what led to this. And so I came across your book of Union Terror, Debunking Justifications for Union's Use of Terrorism Against the Southern Civilians. And I thought, boy, you'd be an interesting person to bring on, because you're coming from a legal, military background with an eye on terrorism. So how did you start kind of delving into, what launched you into this book and this research?
Well, I guess there's many avenues to it, but Paul Harvey used to say the truth is in the rest of the story. So we know if you win a war, you get to write the history books. And so the North won the war. And so a lot of the history books that were produced in the wake of the war were very much along the lines that the North was right and the evil South was the evil South. And they were wrong. Now, my mom's side of the family is from Alabama. I had two direct ancestors in the 2nd Alabama Cavalry. And so during the summers, we'd spend our time in Alabama, and we were taught that that we were resisting invaders, that we were the good guys, and the North was the bad guys. So immediately, I came to the conclusion that somebody's wrong. They both can't be right. They both can't be the good guys, and so I was interested also because I had two direct great grandfathers and that fought in the 2nd Alabama Cavalry. And I remember very vividly my great grandmother, that was her daddy, that was one of them. And I remember my great grandfather, it was his daddy, that was another one. And so the narrative that I was raised with was that, that we were resisting invaders. And of course, as you develop in life and move forward, and with my specialty in operational law, terrorism law, I decided to write this book because you would see, and one of the things that really spurred me to write the book was actually in 1991. General Schwarzkopf was our general that was leading the effort to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And I remember watching on TV at the time. I was teaching at the Judge Advocate General School in Virginia, and they asked General Schwarzkopf, "Who are your military heroes?" And he said, "General Sherman." I about fell off the couch because here is a general that's, in charge of our military, about ready to launch this campaign into Kuwait. And so if General Sherman is your hero, then what can we expect you as a leader of American forces to do? And that would be to, terrorize the civilian population and to burn down their homes and to starve them out and engage in all these evil activities. So I said to myself, one, either this person is ignorant of history and he just reads one side, or he knows the history and he's intentionally ignoring it. So I actually wrote a law review article shortly after that, uh, arguing that Schwarzkopf actually followed the tactics and the humanity of General Robert E. Lee, not General William Tecumseh Sherman. Because if he followed Sherman's tactics, he'd be tried as a war criminal. Lee's tactics, of course, in his humanity is you do a flanking movement and you treat the civilians with respect. You target military issues only. And again, fast forward, this book here was published in 2023. I don't know if you readers can see it, but you can see
Pull it back just a little bit further,
Yeah.
closer to you and
Uh,
down. There we
There
go.
we go.
Yeah,
It
perfect.
looks good from 5 feet away.
Yes.
But basically, the cover has a rather demented looking photo of Sherman. And in the book, I just went at it because I taught law of war at our JAG school to young lawyers. And I would always use Sherman as an example of a war criminal. And I would use Lee as an example of someone that abided by the law of war. So this book kind of looks at the justifications, because you'll see a lot of movies, and even the History Channel did a movie about how great Sherman was, and even conservative thinkers that should know better, like Victor David Hanson, wrote a book calling Sherman the Great Liberator. I mean, no, he was a war criminal. And if the North would have lost the war and the South had the ability, he would have been tried as a a war criminal. And so in the book, I kind of look at the justifications, because most people kind of know what happened when Sherman, went up against Joe Johnston's army in '64, drove it back to the gates of Atlanta. General Hood took over on the Confederate side, not a very good general. Anyway, Sherman was able to capture the city of Atlanta by September, early September. And then he sat there for a little while, and then he received permission from Grant to take his army, 60,000 plus strong, march it across Georgia. And basically, even those that are slightly familiar, they know, that he lived off the land, is what they call it, which means it's an idiom for he burned down homes, uh, slaughtered animals, took them without payment, and did all sorts of horrendous things. And uh, and so this book looks at the justifications. How do you justify that behavior? Because common sense would tell you that's unlawful because there are laws when you go to war. Always been laws. So my book starts out with, the premise is he engaged in terror. I define terror. And then I look at what were the laws, what were the rules of warfare at the time, not today, but at the time. And they're encompassed in a thing called the Lieber Code, which was a law of war book that was authorized and promulgated as binding on all Union forces by the signature of Abraham Lincoln in 1863. And this law of war book took all the different laws that were functioning at the time. They looked at the British rule of law, they looked at the West Point canons, and Lincoln wanted to put it in one book so you could have just one source that soldiers had to abide by. And they called it the Lieber Code because one of the people on the panel that developed it was a law professor or university professor by the name of Francis Lieber. And so it was binding on them. So all you have to do is look at what Sherman did, his behavior, look at the Lieber Code, and compare the Lieber Code to the behavior. And
Yeah,
that's
I
your
want to
standard because, yeah.
let me just interrupt just real quick. I know one of the things it says right here at the Lieber Code, I wrote it down. Men who take up arms against one another in public war do not cease to be on this account to be moral beings responsible to one another and to God. That's
Right.
19 of Lieber Code. And it's interesting, I have a forefathers, my grandmother, Johann, her maiden name is Lieber. So I don't know, maybe there's some connection way back in the ancestry. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So actually, when the Lieber Code was produced, Francis Leader himself started to complain to Lincoln and the administration that these rules are not being followed, particularly in the Western theater. And he said, we need to prosecute people, we need to investigate, we need to do things. Not much was really ever done. That said, that if you're a student of the war, when the war first started, you had rules already in effect. In fact, the Confederate Congress passed their Articles of War in 1861, 2 years before the Lieber Code. And basically, it just reflected stuff that is pretty common sense that you would see in the British law of war. You can't target civilians. Every law of war code in the civilized world, you cannot target with violence civilians. You make war against the armies or the military resources of the enemy. So you're shooting at combatants, or if the soldiers are using railroads, you could blow up the railroad or dismantle the railroad. But you certainly can't go into private homes and burn down the home and steal all the food from the local civilian population because there's not a direct correlation. So the Lieber Code prohibited that. Now, in the Dark Ages during England, you would have armies that would go out and they just raze the countryside. And so you had these civilized rules that were developed to prohibit, warfare against civilians, to mitigate the suffering. And so we have, again, when people say, well, Sherman didn't violate any laws. Yeah, he did. It's a Lieber Code. You can read it. So you just measure his behavior, what he did, and look at the Lieber Code. And I have that all covered in the book. And then, of course, as I said, I went to the various justifications. What justification is used by quote unquote historians to excuse Sherman's behavior? Because very few people say that he acted illegally. They come up with these excuses. And so I identify in the book, 8 excuses. And then I intellectually dismantle all of them. He was a horrible human being, and he was also a war criminal. And I use his own words. I use his telegraphs back and forth to the Lincoln administration, letters to his wife, letters to his brother, where he basically would be very easy to convict in a court for these crimes because he admits to them. In his own words, he admits to them. And then the actions, there's overwhelming evidence about what he did. And so we could talk about some of those justifications. Some of them are quite sad if they weren't so amusing, but it just takes, again, you don't get the other side of this. In any history book, they give a very brief little thing about Sherman and just say, his march to the sea was devastating, and that's about it. They don't tell you what that devastation was and why they did it.
Well, I wanted to ask you about because when I was in Savannah, we came through Savannah. We walked around. We came behind somebody that was doing a tour. We weren't part of the tour, And there was a couple things that I learned. One was he was a big time Freemason, and that Savannah was a big time Freemason setting, and it was one of the reasons possibly that he spared Savannah. The other reason was the official was there was a nice woman there who was friends with his family, and he stayed with her in the mansion, blah blah blah. But the third one that I've heard was it was a port, and it was very, very important to keep that city in place because for merchandise and bringing in shipping and everything, they wanted to retain it. Unlike, let's say, Vicksburg or something, they wanted to maintain that Savannah because it was a logistic port for them to
Sure.
keep. So, but these are kind of little things that you float out there and you hear just in being in a place what we were wandering through the city. Um, but I have heard that he was not a nice man, and I have read a little bit from Lee himself. I used him in a book that I wrote that I'm actually republishing, just a quote out of that, and I've come to realize that Lee was a what do you call that? He did not want to go into the war, but he felt compelled to lead, and that he did what he needed to do the job, but he wasn't gung ho. I'm he was compelled, whereas Sherman, and what I've understood, was gung ho, and he enjoyed what he did. Now, talk to me. Am I even close to
Yeah.
a proximity about that?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the morality of Lee versus Sherman, there's again, when you conduct yourself, there's a legal side and there's a moral side. Uh, and Sherman, of course, could see the suffering that his policies, uh, wrought on thousands of civilians. I mean, he rode along with the army. And I've got many instances in the book, in my follow-up book, Trampling Union Terror, where Sherman would see these people crying. You'd see, women, they're with the little kids, the house is burned down, no food, no nothing. He just walks right by, ignores it. So, but Lee, one word that would really describe Lee would be duty. Lee did his duty. He didn't relish going to war. He was opposed to the war. He was opposed to secession. He was a Union man all the way. But when it came right down to it, as many of the Southern states did, the Upper South, they actually, when the Lower South seceded, they wanted nothing to do with the Lower South. They said, no, we're not going to join the Lower South. What caused them to join the Confederacy was not the issue of slavery, which is a sidebar. It was because Lincoln demanded soldiers from each of the states to form an army to go down and put down the rebellion. And that's why Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, they seceded because of Lincoln's proposed use of violence to settle the secession of the Lower South. Otherwise, they would have never seceded because we know that several slave states stayed in the Union Army. They didn't
Yep.
secede.
Yep.
So, just logically, a lot of people, there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation. And I start out the book, as you know, this is not a brief that the South should have won the war. And that's another characteristic of Lee. Uh, he basically said he was perfectly satisfied the way the war ended, and he was very happy that slavery was ended. But he believed in the fact that God controls history, as all Christians do. So we don't know the future, but we do our duty, and we do it in the best way that we possibly can. That was Lee. So Lee was perfectly satisfied with the outcome of the war because he knew that God controls history. But when you're right in the middle of it, you don't know what the outcome is going to be. And just logically, we arrived. Power hates to give up power. I mean, that's the bottom line. Lincoln did not want to give up power. The same thing when we sent our Declaration of Independence to London. We want to leave. Power hates to give up power. No, you're not leaving. Yeah, we are. No, you're not. We went to guns for 6 years, and we won our freedom through that process. The South never tried to rebel against the North. They just wanted to leave. They wanted to secede. So, but again, my book is not a brief about the South should have
No.
won, blah, 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 because I, as a Christian, believe that God controls history as well. My role model in my family has always been Robert E. Lee. It's not Sherman. I mean, what positive things could you say that you want to emulate about Sherman or Lincoln? As said of Lincoln, that he's the only person that became a Christian after he died.
Yeah,
There's
I
no,
was going to say his
yeah,
writings do not
there's
anywhere,
he
shape,
wrote
or
a
form.
lot. Yeah, he would use the God word, as many people could use the God word, God's on our side. The Nazis used to say God's on our side, which is very convenient. But for example, Robert E. Lee's writing, you can see in his writing, they ask him about Christianity and God. He said, I can only say I'm a poor sinner trusting in Christ alone for salvation. Clear evidence this guy understood the gospel. Lincoln, you're not going to find that. His wife was very upset, actually, when people tried to, associate with him all these Christian things. She said that wasn't him. He was a humanist. So, Lincoln had a very dark side, but he wanted power. And Sherman was his man because Sherman would do anything to maintain that power. And so, some of these justifications that are almost, they're almost humorous if they weren't so sad. And most of you, if I ask you, why did Sherman have to live off the land? Most people would say, well, because he couldn't move his army across Georgia, he had to feed them. Therefore, he had no choice but to draw food from the local civilian population, the cows, the chickens, the food, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what most people would say if they know anything about the history, that he had to live off the land. But of course, in my book, I debunk that because Sherman, in the interim from September until he started the march in November, about a 30-day march, he brought down literally thousands of brand new wagons loaded with over 2 million MREs, as we would call them, rations for his soldiers. He made sure that he had enough food to, without taking an ear of coin from any Southerner, to march across Georgia in 30 days because he wanted to go to Savannah. You're correct. Savannah is where he's going to get resupplied. So you don't burn down the city where you're going to get resupplied.
No.
That's why he spared Savannah. But he had enough food, and he also brought along with him 10,000 cattle in a big cattle herd. So there was no military necessity because the Lieber Code does say if you're in a situation where your army is starving, you can go to the civilian population. If you pay them or give them script for future payment, you can take things that you need. But that's all an absolute lie. He was a logistician. He had 2,500 brand new wagons, 10,000 cattle, over 2 million rations. He didn't need to take anything. And those are facts. So the idea that he had to live off the land is an absolute lie. Another one of the big ones is, well, I was fighting behind enemy lines and I had no choice, et cetera. No, you weren't. Hood's army, when Atlanta fell, they went up to Tennessee. Sherman was going across the state of Georgia. There was no Confederate forces to fight, except for some scattered cavalry under Wheeler. And they're not going to be able to stop 65,000, Federals, including their cavalry. Impossible. So he was fighting nobody. It's this brave movement behind enemy lines. It's not brave. You're making war on women and children. And all the men in the families and the farms, 85% of all white males were in the Confederate military. They weren't home.
No, they
They
weren't.
there.
No.
So
So
those are two of the biggest. And then another one is Sherman would say, well, I couldn't control my soldiers. That's another excuse. I just couldn't control them. They had a lust to burn down homes and pillage, et cetera, et cetera. Well, then you should be relieved immediately. If you can't control your soldiers, then you're a worthless general, but that's a lie. And I talk about in the book how when he wanted to control them, boy, he controlled them. And he had a similar terror campaign in Meridian where he absolutely set guards around homes, had his MPs out there to prosecute and stop any violations of the law of war. So when he wanted to do it, he could do it. He put in this long order before he marched, all these fluffy little things about, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't even curse the Southern civilians. But then he put that one line in there. He said, forage liberally. And that's the only thing the soldiers remember. As a former soldier, we don't care what the boss says. We watch what the boss does.
right,
And that's what we do. And
right.
people got it real quick that the boss wants you to burn down every home, kill every animal, pets, whatever it is. And then all the rape and the pillage that came about, they try to cover that under the rug. But when soldiers burn down the homes and steal and loot, that occurred. And I've got a lot of ample firsthand accounts about that occurring as well. And all that's on his hands. They would torture, they would pillage, almost something not as bad as Hamas against the Israelis, but in many cases, they devastated those innocent civilians. And they're innocents. They're not members of the military, little children. And this is the dead of winter when he went through Georgia. It gets cold in Georgia in November and December. And in the book, I describe some of the instances of what occurred, but again, it's people do not, it's our guy's the right guy. You can do whatever you want to do. The end justifies the means. You'll hear that argument as well. Well, he had to do what he had to do. No, uh, if you were really trying to end the war, because that's what they were saying, we have to do this to end the war. Another justification, which is also untrue. We've got to terrorize these people. And before I get to that justification, if I got a second, I guess we need to back up a little bit because for the first 2 years of the war, the Lincoln administration did a I would say an average job of abiding by the law of war. They didn't have a policy of terrorizing civilians because they wanted it to be a short war. They didn't want to terrorize civilians. They wanted the country to come back together. But by 1863, the end of 1863, it became apparent to Abraham Lincoln that he was not going to get reelected in 1864. He actually drafted letters and stuck it in his drawer to members of the cabinet apologizing because he says, I'm not going to get reelected. McClellan, who's the peace candidate, the Democrat, is going to get reelected because the war is going badly. Robert E. Lee still in the field with the Army of Northern Virginia. Yeah, they got turned back at Gettysburg, but there's still a lot of fire and brimstone in Lee's army. And Lee's army was not being beaten. In the West, the news was a little better, but all the newspapers are in the East. And so the election is going to really be in the eastern parts. And there was a lot of war weariness. You had the New York riots, the draft riots, where the largest mass lynching of Black Americans occurred in New York City during the draft riots, which is a historical point that nobody wants to mention. There was racism in the North and racism in the South, folks. It's not unique to any section of the country. And so in any event, things were not going well. And then Grant took Vicksburg, and Lincoln called Grant to D.C. and said, look, I got to come up with a new strategy. I want to make you the commander-in-chief of all the military. What's your plan? Grant actually came up with a plan to use terror. And so his plan was, well, we're going to create 3 gigantic armies, and each of those 3 gigantic armies will be targeted towards one particular Confederate army. In the past, they just kind of went against one army, and the Confederates could shift troops from one army to the other army when they needed support, like at Manassas or even Chickamauga. So Grant said, I will take on Lee with a gigantic army. Sherman, you take on the Western Army that's around Dalton, Georgia at that time. And Sherman had at his disposal 110,000 soldiers. Johnston had about 35 to 40,000. And then the last one was down in Louisiana, which is kind of inconsequential. But the 2 main ones was Sherman and Grant, because those are the 2 Confederate armies. Johnston in Georgia and Lee in Virginia. So he said, when the spring kicks in 64, we're just going to bundle up like a porcupine, nothing fancy, because we're not going to try to do these outflanking Lee and outsmarting Lee because you're not going to do it. It was a war of attrition. And Grant knew that he could keep losing longer than Lee could keep winning. And so along with his policy, like a big porcupine, we're just going to move forward. And we'll take casualties, but the Confederates will take casualties, and the Confederates have no replacements. We got an unlimited supply of replacements coming off the boats, the Irish and other people. That's why they hated the draft in the North. So Lee, of course, was in a hard spot because Grant also stopped all POW exchanges because he knew the Confederates could get reinforcements by POWs. So he stopped all POW exchanges, even knowing that the Confederacy couldn't even feed their own soldiers, let alone Union POWs. So he's responsible for Andersonville, and all the other Union soldiers that perished was basically Grant. He didn't care because, if I keep doing POW exchanges, Lee's going to get more soldiers back in his army. And then along with that, the short-sightedness of the Confederacy to enlist Black soldiers, Black Southerners into their army. Lee wanted to do it early on. So did Patrick Claiborne. But you had a lot of rich people that owned slaves in the legislature. They didn't want to do it. They finally did it in 1865, where the Confederate Congress authorized an act to raise 200,000 Black Southerners, armed them to fight for the South. Davis signed the law. Too little. They should have done it in 63. Lincoln didn't want to enlist Black soldiers either, but he did it in 63. So that was one point that Lincoln was ahead of the South on that issue, no doubt about it. So Lee had no replacements. And then the third leg on his strategy was to interject this idea of terror. And I've got that all throughout the book, all the telegraphs, all the things that they did. And Grant basically told Sherman, I want you to when you take Atlanta, you have permission to terrorize all the way through Georgia, burn down. He coined a new phrase called war resources. which is not authorized in the Lieber Code. To grant war resources now was any Southerner at all. If you're a Southerner, you're a war resource. And therefore, we can burn down your home, kill all your animals, and do whatever we want to do. That's not allowed by the Lieber Code, but Grant came up with that new term. He told Sherman, go after their war resources. Remember, military necessity would allow you to destroy Confederate trains, Confederate supply depots that supplied to the military, but they never encompassed the civilian farms and the homes. 85% of all Southerners, they didn't own slaves. The average Southerner at that time, you might have 10 acres of corn. You lived in a log dog trot cot cabin, as they called it. You would butcher your own animals. You'd have a smokehouse. Maybe twice a week or once a month, you go into the local town to get salt. But basically, you lived on your own. And so
Yep.
the 10 acres of corn, you would harvest that and sell it for salt or whatever you needed because you needed salt to cure the meat. And that was the average Southerner. No slaves. That's
No,
it.
no,
So
there
when
wasn't.
Sherman marched his army out, that's who he encountered. And generally, the process went as follows. Sherman would have split his army into two wings. Then he split those wings into little groups called foragers or bummers. And they go out as far as they could spread out to the local farms and in groups of 20, 30, sometimes up to, 100, 200 men. They go to an individual home. The first thing they do, there's no man there because they're off in the Confederacy. They'd force the woman to make them a meal. After she made the meal, then they'd ransack the house, and then they'd burn down the house. Then they'd take all the meat out of the smokehouse, burn down the smokehouse, slaughter your cows and your goats or whatever you have, cut off the best pieces of meat, steal your wagon if you had a wagon, throw that in the wagon, and bring it back to the main camp. And if the weather was dry, they'd burn down your crop as well. So you're left there as a mother with their children and elderly with no way to live. I mean, they'd literally burn down everything. And they did that to black Southerners as well as white Southerners. In fact, black Southerners got the worst of it. And these were free blacks and enslaved blacks. It made no difference to these Union soldiers. And a lot of the sexual abuse was visited more often. And I quote two females that wrote on this topic, female historians, on black Southerners. Because, and at that time, if you were raped, women would not report it.
No.
They just would, who are you going to report it to? And if you did report it, then it's going to be gossip's going to go around the community and then marriage and all those other things. So there's a great stigma about reporting these things. So a lot of critics say, well, it was unreported. Yeah, if you know anything about soldiers, if you could burn down and have a heart that is black to burn down their farm, kill every pet animal, they would leave no animals alive. And the ones that they kill for the meat, they would kill the ones they didn't need for the meat. Just leave the carcasses there rotting. That takes an evil person to do that. So as one historian says, not every Union soldier engaged in this, in burning houses, but every house was burnt. So the bad elements were not controlled by their commanders, and the bad elements did whatever they wanted to do. And bad elements are in every, military outfit. And they repeated this time after time after time. So why would they make the woman cook a little meal first? Because if they burned everything down, you're not going to get your free meal.
No.
So they would at least have that much, in their brains. And then of course they would, torture if they did come across some enslaved people that were on a larger house. They would torture them to make those people tell where the silver is buried. They'd string them up by their thumbs. Some of them would never talk, and some of them would talk under torture. So those are war crimes. I mean, and this has happened to thousands of civilians. So why would that happen? And they said, well, we had to shorten the war because if we terrorize these civilians, they'll tell their menfolk to stop fighting, was the theory. Did that work? No. It actually prolonged the war because when word got back to Confederate soldiers, they fought twice as hard. They
Yeah.
said, that's these people that we're going to join again with. We're going to fight to the end. And even the women, I've got many stories here about these women. They would say, you burned down they would mock these women and say, what are you going to live on now? And one woman said, I'm going to live on patriotism. And she looked at her two boys and said, when these boys grow up, they'll still be fighting you. I mean, that's the type of character that most of the Southern women had. They had very strong backbones. They weren't being terrorized. It didn't work. And then you look at it from a military perspective. In 1864, Grant was fighting Lee in Virginia. Sherman had much better luck with Hood and the other army. He outnumbered him 2-1. And so Sherman is in Atlanta, Grant's up around Richmond. If you truly want to end the war, this is the winter of 1864. Instead of sending Sherman across Georgia to terrorize, have him go up to the back door of Richmond and finish Lee off. Sherman's got a gigantic army. He could pull together 100,000 troops easy. You come up the back door, Lee's at the front door. Lee's got a scarecrow army, maybe of 40,000 that are starving in the trenches.
That
And of
would have been
course,
it.
yeah, so, and then you crush them and war's over by New Year's Day. Why didn't they do that? Grant had to know that. He wouldn't do it. You know why? Well, he was an evil man as well. Power lust. He didn't want to share the credit with Sherman. He knew eventually he'd crack Lee because Lee was losing soldiers every day. Grant was losing soldiers every day, but Grant had replacements. He didn't care. Grant was called the butcher by his own soldiers. At Cold Harbor, they lost 7,000 dead and wounded, like an hour. And so the soldiers would pen little notes on their bodies. They called Grant the butcher. But Grant said, no, I'm going to win. It's a war of attrition. Lee has no more replacements. And I'll starve them out. And I'll also use terror in the Shenandoah Valley to burn down all the farms up there so we can't get any more food. So Grant knew he was going to win, but it's just going to take a longer time. It's going to take more human suffering, more death, and more tragedy. If he was truly a man of integrity and a general that really wanted to win and minimize suffering, you just tell Sherman to come up the back door. War's over. He wouldn't do it. So all these people were flawed humans. They cared more about power lust in their souls. They cared more about grabbing, maintaining power. Evil, evil people from a moral perspective and from a law of war perspective. The war would have been over by January. It would have, dragged on until April, and all these thousands of civilians that were abused in the most horrible ways you could think of and starved out, that wouldn't have happened. And if you're truly trying to end the war, that's how you end the war. And that's why Grant never did it. And you won't read that in a history book, but you just use your common sense. You say, well, why didn't you just do that? War's over. And so I cover all these things in the book. This is called The Rest of the Story. This is stuff you're not going to hear in any book. And again, I'm very disappointed. When I went through a lot of the writings and readings of so-called conservative thinkers, like I named Victor David Hanson, that gets on Fox News all the time and very, pompous sometimes. This guy knows better. You're a historian. So why are they drinking the Kool-Aid? Well, because anybody that says anything positive about the South, you're a racist. He doesn't want to be called a racist. Therefore, I'll go along with all the Lincoln lovers and all the Grant lovers and all the Sherman lovers because I don't want to take the heat of being identified with the Confederacy. That's all I can imagine. Or you're just ignorant of history. I can't believe he's that ignorant of history to glorify Sherman and Grant and Lincoln for what they did. So this book holds their feet to the fire. And again, I'm perfectly satisfied that the North won the war. And I have to sell that to people. Oh, you're just a neo-Confederate. No, I'm not. I'm an American. But as an American, as a military officer, it's revolting. It turns my stomach to read that our American leaders made war against women and children on a massive scale when it didn't have to be that way. Now, why is this important? I think I sent you a copy of Signal magazine. This was a magazine that was published by the Nazis during World War II. And this magazine looked like Life magazine. If you remember Life magazine back in the day, very big magazine, lots of pictures in it. So the Nazis had their Signal magazine. They published it in French, Spanish, and German. And in 1944, a retired general friend of mine sent me the original copy of the magazine. It's got Grant on the cover of the magazine. You open up the magazine and it talks about all the war crimes that the Union forces did against Southern civilians. Just lays it bare, what they did, all factual. And the Nazis basically produced that out to their occupied territories. And their message was, this was only 66 years later, 44 to 1944. They did this in 1864, so 80 years later. I believe if my math is correct. And what the Nazis were saying is that, yes, the Allies are invading. They're coming into Normandy, they're coming into Europe, but this is what you can expect from the American soldiers and their leaders. They're going to pillage, they're going to terrorize, they're going to burn down civilian homes, so stay with us. So they're using our own war crimes and propaganda against us. This is the United States of America. And so I use this book as a reminder that we can't repeat this stuff. Because the trouble with man, as Rebecca West once said, he cannot learn those truths that are too uh, complicated, and he forgets those truths that are too simple. So I wrote the book not as an anti-Lincoln or anti-Grant, anti-Sherman. The South had its war criminals as well, but it's like comparing a mountain with a molehill. And of course, most of the battles were fought on Southern territory. But we do know that when Lee went into Pennsylvania on 2 occasions, man, he was strict on his soldiers. Anybody that would even do so much as steal a cow, he'd have executed. He kept strict control with a provost guard on all his soldiers. Now, there were exceptions where, there's always bad people in every army where people went out and committed war crimes, but not on this scale. This was command directed by Grant and Lincoln and approved by Lincoln. Command directed by Grant and Sherman, but did Lincoln know about it? A lot of people, oh, Lincoln didn't know about it. Yeah, he did. Lincoln knew exactly what was going on. He chose to stick his head in the sand and ignore it all. So he could kind of say, oh, I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what was happening. No, he knew exactly what was going on. Lincoln was a micromanager. He sat down at the telegraph office almost every day for any news that came of anything about the military. He knew everything that was going on. And I've got evidence of that also in the book. So he's without excuse. Again, I'm an American. These are Americans. This should not have taken place. So I wrote it to set the record straight. And, some people get very upset with it. But intellectually, I always tell them, well, show me where I'm wrong. Show me where my facts are wrong. Show me that he did not have a cattle herd of 10,000 cattle with his army. Show me where that's wrong. Show me where he didn't have 2 million rations. Show me where he was fighting an army in Georgia. Point out to me where they can't. They get emotional and they do name calling. Well, you're this, you're that. I got a thick skin. Yeah, I don't care, buddy. But intellectually, you can't debate me because the facts are not on your side and the law is not on your side. The law being the Lieber Code. He violated those provisions of the Lieber Code that prohibited what he did. And yet they threw a parade for Sherman in Washington, D.C. at the close of the war, and he hailed him as a hero. And then part two, I speak a little Lakota. My dad's from the Dakotas. They called upon Sherman and Sheridan and his other subordinates that engaged in terror. We want you to use those same tactics against the Plains Indians. We're having a tough time with them. And they took it to the nth degree against the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho. They just burned down their teepees, murdered them, starved them out. They made war against civilians. Where did they get the idea? From what they did to Southerners. And that's why it took so long for the reconciliation between North and South to occur, because of the war crimes that were committed. It doesn't facilitate a quick rejoining of the country. And in fact, people still talk about Sherman in the Deep South in derogatory terms, as they should. And that's 150 years later.
When I was in Vicksburg, one of the things the historian was telling us at the mansion was that up until I think it was 1968, the people of Vicksburg did not celebrate 4th of July.
1945. That's true. 1945.
1945, because
that's the first time they celebrated July the 4th.
Yep, because
the close of World War II.
When they got they got taken over and just demolished.
Yeah.
Now I want to ask you a couple things. I see a lot of parallels of what went on there and what you said that went on against the Native Americans. But it seems to me that every world war, carpet bombing cities became part and parcel to warfare. And so these are innocent individuals. We're not talking about going to a military barracks or a magazine or a shipyard. We're talking about firebombing hundreds of thousands and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of individuals. And we've seen that World War I. We especially saw World War II.
Yes.
All forces, the British, the Japanese, the Americans, the Germans, all carried this out. And it seems to me that style of warfare is just escalated. It hasn't gotten better. It's like, okay, if we're going to have a battle, And then I see the same thing. Israel is just demolishing Palestine, has been for 75 years. And they are, you know, headshots to babies, headshots to kids. This is just children and cutting them off. And it's not, oh, Hamas against IDF. It's actually destroying and leveling. And we saw that with apartheid Africa when they tried to break free. You saw the same kind of thing. You see this in nations around the world where they use genocidal styles of going in and just wiping out populations, not the military, but the populations as a means
Oh,
of destroying the morale, oppressing the people, and giving them a hopelessness. And so talk to me about this
sure.
idea that terror throughout history now up to this present day has been used to demoralize and actually dehumanize one's supposed enemies, and how that plays out as a um, as a psychological, emotional, spiritual blackness that actually I think encompasses the entire earth at this point in time, because no one's really talking about it. No one's dealing with this. It's just we shove it under the table, we move on, and generationally we've never talked about this kind of thing. We want to ignore it. You've got your book, you can talk about that. That was back then. But talk to me about today and throughout our
Sure.
history now of these tactics just being part of everyday warfare when I don't think they should be, but they are.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've got to go back to the premise that man, according to every major religion, is a fallen being. We are
Yep.
imperfect. So as the Lord Christ said, God can read your mind. So you don't commit adultery, but if you think about it, you're guilty of the crime. You may not commit murder, but if you hate somebody in your heart, you're guilty of the crime. So that you have a very high standard. So the law of war actually first developed, if you go back in time, it was the Hebrews that have the first really recorded law of war. Moses wrote it down. And so when the Hebrews moved into the land to conquer that particular land, they were given very specific rules of behavior. And that's what the law is. It tries to, both from a criminal perspective, it tries to give us the rules that we have to live by in order to live together with humans. Because man left to his own devices, it would be a pretty sad story. So laws try to regulate and maintain stability, both in the civilian world and then when you go to war. So there's always been in the civilized world laws regulating warfare. So if you go to the book of Deuteronomy, for example, it says God commanded the Hebrews, when you go up to a city to besiege the city, you have to give them an opportunity to surrender. If they do surrender, you can't torture people. It also says that the fruit trees surrounding the city, you may not cut those trees down. And so a lot of the stuff that they have in Deuteronomy is pretty common sense materials. On the
Hmm.
other hand, you would have some instances, that's the main law of war the Hebrews had. But then if you're a student of the Bible, you'll see other cases where God said, go in and kill every man, woman, and child, wipe them all out. So how do you reconcile one with the other? Well, again, you've got to look at the context because every war is different. So you have this conundrum, apparently, that civilized rules, but then kill every man, woman, and child. That's not civilized. Well, what's the difference? Why? Why some groups kill them all? Well, as a historian, most people can't answer that question, but I'll answer it for you. The groups that God commanded the Hebrews to kill them all, they were engaged in a religious system where they would take their young children and they would roast them alive while they had orgies around the idol. And I think we'd all agree that's pretty decadent. Their god was called Baal or Baal,
Yep.
and he
Yep.
would sit on top of a furnace and they just have orgies while they roasted them alive. So those people got to go. And of
And
course,
then
the Hebrews didn't
unfortunately,
kill them all. As you
right.
know, your Bible, they started to do the same stuff.
I was going to say Israel itself ends up doing the same thing.
Yeah, because they didn't follow the commandment. They didn't kill them all.
No, and they
And so
also,
there's always exceptions to the rule. But now, so fast forwarding in the civilized world, there's a lot of reasons why you keep the law of war. One is pragmatism, like Savannah. Pragmatism. I don't want to burn this down because I've got to use a facility. So, and then another pragmatic thing, if we torture or kill POWs, they're going to do it to us. So therefore, we'll respect your POWs if you respect our POWs. So pragmatism is always there, aside from just the moral, the right thing to do. You don't murder people, you don't target civilians. That's part of your moral compass. And so, as the law of war is developed, right now we have the Geneva Conventions of 1949. is the revision, but they've always kind of been the same. You don't target civilians unless there's a reason. Now, in Vicksburg, the Union can't be totally at blame for what they did because that was a city. Under the Lieber Code, as long as you warn the city that we're going to besiege you, then you can besiege the city, give the civilians an opportunity to leave. In Atlanta, Sherman never did that. He just started bombarding the city. So you're required by the law of war to give them a warning before you engage in that activity. So World War II, as you mentioned, people talk about, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We killed far more Japanese in the firebombing of Tokyo.
That's right.
We did that intentionally.
That's right.
That was a war crime. We
was.
intentionally targeted with napalm those wooden homes because our theory was we're going to make the Japanese surrender, kind of like Sherman. But no one was ever prosecuted because we won the war. Now, that was a war crime, no doubt about it. The Nagasaki and Hiroshima, in my mind, from a legal perspective, was not a war crime. We dropped leaflets. We warned them that the big one's coming. They were military targets. They were facilities that supplied stuff to the military. And so we followed the law of war as it then existed for those two things, but that's kind of a sidebar. Dresden, the firebombing of Dresden, killing, nobody knows how many German civilians were alive.
No.
On the other hand, the Germans committed war crimes.
Oh, yeah.
War crimes. But just like the North and South, it's like comparing a mountain with a molehill. The Nazis, brutalized and executed, exterminated millions of people, 6 million Jews, but that's just scratch the surface. They don't count the other people that they also incinerated in death camps and all the other stuff they did. So both sides have blood on their hands, but it's all relative. So relatively speaking, we have a better record of going to war, protecting civilians, doing these things than any other nation on the face of the earth, with the exception of Israel. And I've got to take issue with you about Israel. Hamas intentionally hides amongst the civilians. They intentionally have their headquarters in hospitals. They intentionally put their supply depots in mosques. They embed themselves in with the civilian population to protect themselves because they're cowards. So when you slaughter 1,200 Jews, which they did on October the 7th, the Israelis obviously are going to come for you, but they don't stand out in open battlefields. They hide amongst the civilians. The Israelis have no choice, but the Israelis always notify those areas before they come in and attack. They call on cell phones, civilians. They notify, we're coming, you need to evacuate. But the news media wants to spin it like, oh, the Israelis are wiping out, committing genocide. No, they're not. All the civilian casualties that occur, the blood's on Hamas's hands and Hezbollah because they shield themselves with civilians. They're cowards. They don't fight out in the open. And so
you and I will just flat out disagree on that. I've got.
Oh, well, you can disagree all you want, but the facts are on my side.
Well, I've got facts on the other side. I could bring in guests about that. And
no, you can't. They're drinking the Kool-Aid. The Israelis have the finest military on the face of the earth. They have no choice other than, oh, okay, we're going to leave you alone. They have to go into those cities. And those tunnels are there. They supply and use mosques and hospitals. Those are facts. Their main headquarters is underneath the main hospital in Gaza. So what am I supposed to do? I can't touch you. You've got to go in. And they warn those areas before they go in. So we'll agree to disagree, but no, the facts are there. I've been there. I've seen it. I've worked with the IDF. They have the most professional military the world has ever seen. Do a thought experiment. If the Israelis laid down their guns, they would all be dead. If Hamas laid down their guns, there'd be peace like that. True?
I don't agree. I don't agree at all.
No, I just asked you a question. Is that true or false? If Hamas laid down their guns, would there be peace right now?
If
Israel laid down their guns, what would happen? They'd all be killed.
No, they wouldn't.
The Israelis were established in 1948. They were recognized as a nation. What did the surrounding countries do when they heard that news? They attacked to obliterate them off the face of the earth. They did. Those are facts.
Yeah, so is
the
the
United Nations recognized them as a nice,
750.
lawful nation state. You can't attack another country.
No. 750 people.
1948, 1967, they attacked again. 1973, they attacked again.
Yeah.
They've tried to kill, they want to kill all the Jews.
That's propaganda.
So there's no question the Israelis are in the right.
Well, you believe that. Yeah, I know you believe that. And
well, I give you facts. Refute the facts.
I can give you facts.
750,000
people
attacked their neighbors in 1948.
750,000 people were fleshed out through the Nakba that Israel committed on Palestine.
That is propaganda. You get those numbers from Hamas. Hamas is giving you the numbers.
No, this is historical
if they
UN
can murder,
numbers.
they can lie to you. The United
No,
Nations is a worthless organization. They have Hamas elements embedded in the UN. Are you kidding me? Okay, 1948. Did the Jews attack their neighbors when they were established as a state? Yes or no?
they did the Ben Gurion Hotel. They
Did
blew
they
it up.
attack
I got
other
things.
states in 1948?
They
It's a yes
shoved
or no.
out.
That's easy.
I'm saying
No,
that the Nakba was when they came in and they took over
no,
their
no.
lands.
In 1948, the United Nations said, here is your land.
Yes,
Everybody agreed, this is our land.
yeah.
What happened almost immediately? The surrounding Arab nations attacked them. They didn't attack the surrounding Arab nations. Those are facts. I mean, that's a fact.
Well,
From the very get-go, they've been fighting a war of survival. So yeah, no, I'm not going there with you on that at all.
and I'm
As I
not
said, I
going
won't
there
say I
either.
mean, my eyes are wide open.
So are mine.
They're the Iranians, Hamas and Hezbollah, they do not want to recognize a Jewish state. Their position is, we want to kill you all. You cannot negotiate with people when that's their position. There's no negotiate with them. So in any event, yeah, so you got to look at the historical context. I'm hearing from you almost the same stuff I hear from people that support Lincoln, Grant, and Sherman.
No,
Sorry.
I don't. You get me wrong. I don't support
Well,
violence
you don't
at
have your
all.
facts right about Israel and
No,
the
I've got
so-called
facts.
innocent Palestinians.
I've got facts, but we don't have
Okay, I'm
time
going to
for
send
me
you
to
my
blow
latest
those
law
out.
review article that's coming out in about a week, where I have hundreds and hundreds of footnotes to prove everything I just said. But
Okay.
48, they were attacked. They didn't attack. 67, they were attacked. 73, Yom Kippur War, they were attacked. On October the 6th, there was peace. On October the 7th, who attacked who? 1,200 people slaughtered in the most brutal way. What are the Israelis supposed to do? Oh, thank you. Can we have another? You've got to respond. You've got to defend yourself. They have the right to defend themselves.
I
The Arab worlds are trying to kill them all. You talk about indiscriminate bombing. Every bomb that goes from the Arabs, they don't pinpoint it. They just massively send in bombs, not against military targets. The Israelis target military targets. There is collateral damage, but that's the way war is. They don't target civilians. Never have. Now, do individual Israeli soldiers commit war crimes here and there? Sure they do. But as a national policy, no way.
well, I'm just saying this. I'm on a different wavelength than that. I don't agree with either side killing either side. I'm not for war. Period.
Well, who is for war? I'm not for war either, but you have
But
to defend yourself
I
when you're being
don't
attacked.
I don't condone violence.
Well,
And I knew we would have a great,
but
lively discussion
yeah,
because
some
you're
people say violence never solved anything. Yes, it does. What do you think stopped the Nazis? Violence. You can't negotiate with totalitarian regimes. The Israelis have tried to negotiate with the Palestinians. They offered the Palestinians a state under the Clinton Camp David things. The Palestinians got 96% of what they wanted on the negotiating table. Yasser Arafat wouldn't take it because their goal is to kill them all and take over the land. That's what they tell
so
you that.
they'll never be able to do that. We know that. That's
Well,
not
yeah, they
gonna
will.
happen.
If you don't defend yourself, they will. If the Israelis disarm like people want them to do, yeah, they'll kill them all. That's what they want to do. So they're not interested in negotiation. They're not interested in a two-state solution. They want to kill you. The Hamas charter says that. We want to kill you all.
Well,
You have no choice but to defend yourself. So yes, violence does solve things. The proper application of violence is sometimes the only thing that will solve things. That's what stopped the Nazis. You're not going to negotiate with the Nazis. You're not going to negotiate with the Hamas.
I agree. I agree. My dad was in World War II, but he
Well,
was,
then violence does solve things.
well, I'm
I'm
just
for
telling you.
violence.
What's that? You think
I am
that,
for violence if the violence is justified. In this case of Israel,
okay,
of
so
course it's justified.
so you are a lawyer, and I'm going to talk about morality for a moment. If I don't like my neighbor and I pull out a gun and I shoot him because I want his land or
Yeah.
I don't like him, I would be taken before a court and I would be prosecuted and put in jail for that.
And that comes to mind, Hamas against Israel. Yeah. They
No,
don't
no, no,
like
no,
them,
no.
want their
I'm
land, kill
talking
them.
about I'm
That's,
talking about
I do that
everybody.
parallel immediately because that's their mindset.
No,
Yeah.
no, I'm not talking about Hamas now. I'm not talking
You're in
about
the
Israel
wrong.
right now.
Okay.
I'm
Well, you're in the wrong. Obviously, you're in the wrong. You cannot commit murder.
Right. But in the war where my government tells me that I have an enemy and I have to go
Yes.
kill them,
That's not murder.
I am not
No.
now
Now, as a Christian, the Bible says, thou shalt not murder, true or false? False
true.
doesn't say that. It says, thou shalt not kill.
Right.
You have the right to kill the enemy in combat. You have the right to execute with the death penalty criminals. It doesn't say thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not murder.
I
I
know it
think I
says
mixed
thou
that
shalt
up.
not
The
murder.
word in Hebrew is katal. It doesn't
Right.
say thou shalt not kill. You see these people carry out. The Bible says thou shalt not kill. I can't join the military. It doesn't
No,
say that. It says thou
no, it
shalt not
says,
murder, which is the
no, no,
unlawful
no.
activity
I
of your
know
life.
that. I
Yeah.
already knew it said thou shalt not murder. I understand
Right.
that. But
Okay.
when my government tells me I have an enemy and Jesus says, love your enemies and do
Jesus
good.
holds the record for killing people. Did you know that?
Yeah,
When he comes
70
back the
AD.
second coming, he's going to kill a lot of people, according to Old Testament and New Testament.
So that
Outside the gates of
justifies us
Assyria
as,
in 701 BC, he killed 185,000 people. Now, God holds the record for killing people.
oh yeah, he flooded the earth.
Well, yeah. So, yeah, Jesus didn't say, Jesus used violence. This idea that Jesus didn't use violence, of course he used violence. He used bad words too. Your father's the devil.
Oh, I know that. I call
And he
people
also
that all
picked
the
up the
time.
money changers, whipped them, and threw them down the stairs. So violence is justified on occasion. And Jesus used violence, but it's lawful violence versus unlawful violence. A lot of these people have no idea what would Jesus do, and they automatically think that he's, an 80-pound weakling that wouldn't do anything. No, that's not what the Bible says. I also teach a Bible class at the law school, and I am an originalist, a strict constructionist. What does it say? Of
Yeah,
course,
me
he uses
too.
violence.
But I'm a
And
new,
your
I'm
government
an
tells you to
under,
go to war. You should be the best killer. If you're a Christian, you should be the best killer in your outfit.
I can't do that.
Of course you. Well, then you're not a Christian.
That's,
You're not reading the Bible. The
what
Bible
do you
says
mean
that
I'm
you're
not a
due.
Christian?
Well,
You know
the
how many,
Bible.
for the
Well,
first 300 years, Christianity died of martyrs. They didn't go in the war. They didn't
oh
go
my
fight for
golly,
the battle.
one of the best Roman legions was made up of Christians. So yeah, so Christianity uses violence. As you know, when the German barbarians were coming in to take over Rome, the bishop there was asked, "What should we do?" He said, "Fight them." Moses was a great warrior. Joshua was a great warrior.
I
David's a great
know.
warrior. So yeah, no, Christianity doesn't mean that you're lets people walk all over you. You engage in violence if your government calls you. If you work for the state and your job is to execute criminals, execute them. Because if we don't have people doing that, we wouldn't be here today if we didn't use lawful violence. So my reading of the Bible is violence is authorized. And if you, as a Christian, we're supposed to do the best we can do. If I'm a soldier, I'm going to do the best I can do, which is kill the enemy. Why would I be a soldier?
That's
And
why I
I'm a
would not be
Christian.
a
I am a
soldier.
Christian. I have no problem killing the enemy. Not at
I know
all.
that. I know that. And I understand
And
that.
neither did Robert E. Lee. He was a great Christian.
Yep.
When I said you're not a Christian, I didn't mean to imply that you're not a Christian. I'm just saying that your interpretation of what a Christian's supposed to do, in my opinion, is not correct. And one of us is wrong. Either you're
Yes.
wrong or I'm wrong. I got all that. We can
I
agree
know
to
that.
disagree.
I know. I'm just trying to bear the fruit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. And the
Yes.
opposite is anger,
Right.
wrath, malice,
Yeah.
anger,
I don't
murder,
get
and
angry
all
when I
that.
kill people. I don't get angry. Turn the other cheek is an idiom. If someone tries to hit you in the face, you have every right to defend yourself. That's an idiom, which means if someone gossips about you, mental attitude stuff, you don't gossip back. If someone tries to come into your house and kill your family, what are you going to do? Oh, bless you. No, I'm going to blow you away with a shotgun. And I'm
I
going to
know
do it
that
without anger,
is,
without
I,
malice, with a
I,
relaxed mental attitude.
I
I'm
know
not in
that's modern
sin.
day Christianity. I
That's
understand.
not modern. That's in the Bible. That's thousands of years ago.
Are we under the old covenant or the new covenant?
Well, it depends. There's 7 covenants. Which covenant are you talking
Are
about?
we under the new covenant that Christ inaugurated, or are we under the old
Yeah,
covenant that
well, we're
Moses
in the church
inaugurated?
age. And in the church age, we're in union with Christ, as you know, as a Christian. First of all, how do you become a Christian? You become a Christian by believing that Christ died on the cross for your sins, period. You don't have to be good. Being good is not a requirement to be saved. You
I
don't have
know
to get
that.
dunked in water. You don't have to count beads. You don't have to jump up and down 5 times. You merely say, with a speck of faith more than none at all, I'll take it. As a thief on the cross. And
I
you're in.
know. I agree.
Very easy. Once you're in, what are you supposed to do? Where Paul, as you know, said
Transformation.
in Corinthians, you're babies. You're supposed to learn the mind of Christ and put it in your brain. So
Right.
in this dispensation, the mind of Christ is very clear. Yeah, you have the right to defend yourself. And Jesus, again, used violence. Those are facts. In the proper context, of course, you have the right to defend yourself. But he didn't do it in anger when he whipped those people with a whip.
Nope.
Did he? No. So it's a mental attitude sense. So yeah, I have no problem exercising lawful violence. And no, I'm not sinning when I do it. I'm fulfilling my Christian duty, as Lee did. Lee had a very relaxed mental attitude. He didn't call the Yankees, these evil people and dirty names. He just said those people. He had a very relaxed mental attitude, but so did Stonewall Jackson. But they killed a lot of Yankees. They sure did. And it was completely justified under the law of war. They killed enemy combatants. They didn't target civilians. That's all I'm saying. So yes, it's a system of thinking. But so
Well,
morally,
I know, and I don't come with a dispensational thinking mindset. I come from a different mindset within Christianity.
okay. Well, one of us is wrong. We'll find out on the other side. That's one
We
of the good things
will.
about Christianity. We're very tolerant. Islam's not tolerant. Radical Islam is not tolerant. They will kill you. And
Oh,
they've
I'm
killed
not
more
saying,
Muslims than
listen,
Christians or
I
Jews.
don't compare me what I'm telling you and saying
No, I'm
I
not.
support radical Islam or
Well,
radical
I'm going
anything. I
back
do
to
not.
Israel and their right to defend themselves because that's fundamental.
I have people that were, I'm just saying, I know people that were living there that are Christians that witnessed things and had nothing to do. We're talking 20 years ago. Okay. We're not talking about just recently. But the point being is we don't think like a Jew because we're not Jewish. We are a Christ follower. That's me. I'm a Christ follower. So I'm born again. I have the mind of Christ. And yeah,
Right.
Christ wiped out a lot of people at 70 AD. That was destruction of Jerusalem. It was horrific. I'm reading the Josephus right now. It was horrific. That was God's judgment. He came back as he said he would. And so when you understand that, God, and it says, vengeance is mine, thus saith the Lord. So I get that. And I understand about protecting one's belongings, protecting one's assets, protecting one's country. But I think that a lot of wars, even Smedley Butler's War as a Racket does a really good job of saying a lot of wars are not fought according to what you and I have been told they're fought for. And I'm just at a point where I look at a lot of wars, you and I are, you be the soldier, you go do your duty, you're following your orders. I commend you for what you're doing. You're following the law of that. But on the other side, why are we doing what we're doing? Is there not
We're
sitting
human
down?
beings.
What's that?
As the Lord Christ said, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars until when?
At
Until I
the
come
end.
back. He ain't back.
Nope.
So we're always going to have another. Now, in the American system, we also have the concept that if an officer gives me an unlawful order, I don't have to follow it. So if I see someone tied up against a tree and my officer comes over and says to shoot that person, I will be prosecuted as a war criminal because that's an unlawful order. And I'm expected under the objective standard to understand that. So in the American system, it's the same in the Israeli system. You can be prosecuted for following unlawful orders, like My Lai massacre in Vietnam. Those people were prosecuted because the officer gave them illegal orders. My Lai was one of the enlisted soldiers and carried out the orders. You can't defend yourself by saying, I was ordered to do it, because a reasonable person would understand that you don't kill women and children. And so you can't escape by saying, I'm just following orders, like the Germans. No, in the modern world, and again, I use the United States of America because in our standard, soldiers only are required to follow lawful orders. We're not required to follow unlawful orders. So if an officer gives you a command to slaughter civilians, you're under obligation to not follow that command.
So in
And so
your
that's why we have lawyers in the military like myself. I accompanied soldiers in the field, and my job was to make sure we followed the civilized rules when we killed the enemy.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. You do, when you are in there in the military and you're standing side by side, or you're their advocate, because people have said that in the situation with the crossfire, whatever the situation was being, and who was it was putting charge? Let's say you've got 120 men off of faulty charges against
Yeah.
them. What would those charges? Who would be laying those charges against those individuals, and how would you come in and help them out in those situations?
Well, I'll give you a couple examples. Two Green Berets in Afghanistan, a bomb maker had infiltrated the village where they're at. They found out the bomb maker is a hut number 54. They sent their interpreter into the hut. Bad guy came out of the hut. They blew his brains out with a sniper rifle. The Taliban, like all these totalitarian groups are, they got a hold of a newspaper reporter in Afghanistan, I think it was New York Times, and they said, the Green Berets have killed our village elder. A lie. If you can murder, you can lie. And so that story came back to the United States. A general read it and ordered the subordinate general to arrest those two Green Berets, charge them with murder, and bring them back to the United States for trial, which they did. And so once we sorted out the facts that it was a lie, they killed an enemy combatant. And under the law of war, the best time to kill an enemy combatant is when they're not shooting at you. You can shoot them when they're looking around or eating dinner because they're an enemy combatant. You cannot shoot them if they put their hands up to surrender. This guy didn't have his hands up to surrender. Another case, we have the law of war in the United States, and then on top of that, we have rules of engagement, which are not in the law of war, but they're self-imposed. They're political rules imposed by the president to win the hearts and the minds of the people. So, for example, one rule of engagement might say that if the enemy's in a civilian home shooting at you, you may not shoot back. Law of war would tell you you can shoot back, and if civilians are killed in that home, that's the way it goes. It's called collateral damage. Now, when the Taliban found out that our rule of engagement said if they go into a civilian home and shoot at you, we can't shoot back, what do you think they did?
Oh yeah,
They went into civilian homes and started shooting at us. And so, and if our soldiers violate that rule of engagement, they haven't violated the law of war, but they can be prosecuted for violating a self-imposed rule. It's like we're going to fight the war with one hand tied behind our back. As an illustration, when President Trump came into office, he called his generals together. He said, look, here's the goal. I want you to obliterate ISIS from the face of the earth. We're not going to do like a Harvard term paper and do a drone strike here, a drone strike there, as the previous administration had done. I want you to kill them, rub them out, destroy their capital city. The general said, okay, boss, we would love to do that. We need two things. One, give the authority to use violence down to the local level at the company grade level. And two, get rid of the rules of engagement. And President Trump said, done and done. 3 months later, what occurred? They were wiped off the face of the earth. Why didn't the previous administration do that? That's another question. But that's how you wage war. You do it quickly, you get it over with, and you return to a system of peace as fast as you possibly can. We didn't violate the law of war. We just got rid of the rules of engagement. So a lot of the soldiers that I represent have fallen prey to these supercilious rules of engagement that make no sense. Absolutely no sense. So, democracies tend to put those things on top of the rules of engagement.
Well, I was going to say when in Rules, the Art of War, Sun Tzu,
Yep.
he talks about when you're engaging, you want to make it as quickly as possible.
Absolutely.
The more prolonged a war is, Vietnam was this forever prolonged war, and
Right.
even the war on terror, the prolonged
Same in
war,
Afghanistan, 20 years.
it sucks the morality out of the troops. It sucks the morality out of the countries, and it's not accomplishing what the goal was. And whereas the Civil War was the war between the states was a 4-year war. And you said that if they had done it correctly, it could have been shortened even by another year?
At least 6 months, at
At
least.
least 6 months. So some people think that a lot of times war today is not about winning, it's about keeping the machine going. And
That's correct.
what's that?
You can make that argument in Ukraine, but see, that's the difference between a president, and again, I'm just stating facts. President Trump, when he used our military, he used it decisively. In the past, other presidents, Republicans and Democrats, they strung out the thing for 20 years, Vietnam, 10 years, and soldiers on the ground, they're not stupid. So why am I going to get killed and blown up in this war when we know we're not here to win it?
Right,
There's
right,
no end in sight. It's
right.
bad for morale, as you indicated, very true. And yet we have professional soldiers that do it anyway because that's their duty, that's their job. And we've lost a lot of people. We spent over $2 trillion in Afghanistan, and basically we were defeated. Well, we defeated ourselves. We did an unconditional withdrawal. That wasn't Trump's plan. Trump's plan was for a conditional withdrawal, leaving forces there as we needed to. And that signals weakness to the world. So you can't fight everybody.
No, we're not
Deterrence is a
supposed
wonderful
to.
factor. You fight one group and you cause the other groups that are out there to refrain from using violence because they see what happened. I'm a big believer in deterrence.
So like walk silently, carry a big stick. That
Well, that's also, with democracies, you don't need to use war. If you're a fellow democracy, we can talk to you and we can negotiate. like the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Israelis have tried to negotiate for decades with the Palestinians. We'll give you 2 states. All we want you to do is recognize us, and we have borders, and don't kill us. I mean, but you can't negotiate with totalitarian mindsets. All you have left is a stick, which is violence, and it's tragic. But this thing could stop very quickly in many cases, like Ukraine. I mean, there should be a negotiated settlement. But every war is different. I mean, you've got to look at each war and see what the factors are and apply the law of war. Um, and so there's general principles, which I agree. You want to get it over as quickly as possible. That's one of the reasons that Truman authorized the dropping of the atomic bomb, because he did a math calculation. If we have to invade the islands of Japan, we're going to lose 1 million people. And we're probably going to kill who knows how many Japanese civilians. If I drop this big bomb, which is devastating, yeah, we're going to kill 70,000, 140,000, but that'll convince them to surrender. And it worked. He actually saved a lot of lives, both Americans and Japanese, by that decision. So
I mean,
again,
my
I'm
father was
justified.
in the Philippines and he was in the cleanup crew. So he would have been that second wave of individuals he was in the army, and he would have been that second wave brought in to continue that war in the Pacific. Would have been my
Oh yeah,
father and
it'd be horrendous.
his generation, those that came in. It's because you have the ones on the European side, and then you have the Pacific side, and then that took place, and it was over with. And so I am grateful that my father was able to live, and his friends that they all went in together. They all got drafted together, and they all came out. But yeah, I'm not opposed to stopping things quickly. I sometimes think that there's spiritual forces that prolong things that are beyond you and I, and they get into minds men's and they control them. And there's also a lot of profits made in war. There's a ton
Oh
of
yeah,
profits made in war,
sure.
and unfortunately, the soldiers are the first to be on the front line. And you guys, you lay down your life for your country, and yet you're the first ones to be taken out of the way if things turn badly in a war, and the guys back home armchair quarterbacking it, making decisions to stay there for X amount of time. They're not thinking about you. They're thinking, geez, my stock shares are going up. I'm selling more Raytheon. I'm very jaded on this stuff. I don't like the fact that you, as an officer, your fellow, our military, get used for things that they should not get used for. And I just don't support such things.
Yeah, but it's the nature of man. These things are going to continue: greed,
I
avarice,
know, I
lust.
know.
So we just do the best we can. We've got to, our country, as blemished as it is the greatest country the world's ever seen. Because as bad as we are, look around you at other countries and how they conduct themselves. And by the grace of God, we have that reputation. So I want to ensure that our soldiers in the future understand, that we had bloodstains on our own hands. Our record in World War II is not perfect, but we got to strive to keep doing the best that we can. So again, a lot of it boils down to leadership. It really does. Lee, the army, the soldier, the men in Lee's army and the men in Lincoln's army, they're the same people. They were raised on farms. They were in basically, most of them Protestants, had the same value system: don't steal, don't lie, don't cheat. Um, why did these men in the North turn into animals? Because of leadership. Because the dark side of humans, when you allow it to run free,
Oh, I know.
it's going to happen. So you've got to keep, I blame the leadership. Just like in our own country, we got good leadership, things prosper. We got bad leadership, things decline.
As Proverbs says that all throughout the book of
Oh, yeah,
Proverbs. Yep.
very true. That's why with the upcoming election, I mean, we've got a stark choice to make. I'm not telling people who to vote for, but I know who I'm voting for. But there is a choice, and people need to educate themselves, because a lot of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda is being strewn all over the place. And you've got to do your own research, because if you're just relying on, certain sources, it's not going to work. And that's amazing to me. You expect to be brainwashed in North Korea, but in our society, the freest, openest society the world's ever seen, you could be totally brainwashed. Absolutely, I run across it all the
I
time.
I write about that all the time,
Oh yeah,
about being programmed, and my whole book's all about that. But the aspect of renewing one's mind. I've got a stack a mile high, well, not a mile high, but I could stack all my books next to my bed and they're 2 feet tall because I'm constantly reading and trying to understand the world we live in and trying to grasp and utilize history and reading because I find that that's where a wealth of knowledge is found is in books written by people like yourself and others who have done deep digs. And then I look for primary documentation myself. My computer's full of it. So when I talk about something, when I'm writing about something, I want to document it like you. I want the footnotes. I want to have all the
Oh yeah.
references there that a person can say, "Oh, well, he's not just pulling that out of my ear, that I've actually shown you that this is the situation." And so I know you've got to get going, but I
You know
wanted
that
to
quote by Mark Twain?
what's that?
Mark Twain. He said, "I never let my schooling interfere with my education." You've got to self-educate as obviously you're doing, and because a lot of us have certain perspectives, and it's my side. You don't look at the other side, and that's dangerous. I mean, as I tell my students, and they're lawyers, I said, are you guys deep thinkers? Oh, I'm a deep thinker. I'm a deep thinker. Really? Oh, I'm a deep thinker. Well, what's the deepest thought you can think? Well, what happens when you die? Okay. So most of us religiously, you are what you are because that's what your parents were. You're a Hindu. I would say if I'm a betting man, your parents are Hindu. If you're a Buddhist, parents are Buddhists.
Yep.
Islam, parents are Islam. Okay, there's 7 major religions. Each of them say we're the truth and the other one's not the truth. And you're going to hell. So you're born into one of them, and that's what you know.
Yep.
So if you're a deep thinker, you would have read all 7 of them to decide which one you believe in. And if you haven't read all 7, you ain't a deep thinker, dude. You're just,
I taught a class on the 7 major religions, and I gave the highlights of what each one of them believes, and then I looked and then you compare it to the teachings of Scripture, your teachings of Christ, and it's like you have to go what is it that you believe and why,
yeah,
and have you compared it to the other groups out there, and they all fall short. I mean, only Christ Himself. Look, He's the only one who claimed to be God. And as C.S. Lewis said, he was either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord, but he can't be either one of the three.
right.
He has to be one of the three. And if he is the Lord and the world was created by him, for him, and through him, then we better listen. And that's my hue and cry. And I'm constantly looking at what did the deep thinkers of the faith taught, and what did people on the outskirts of the faith thought. Even the outcasts that the mainline churches didn't like because they pushed them and they challenged them. And I'm like, he challenged. He says, I am truth. And what did the religious leaders do? They wanted to kill him again and again and again because he was going against the status quo. He was going against the empire of his day. And what we're called to do is to stand true according to him, regardless of what my neighbor or my father says. I'm going to be held. You and I are both going to stand before the Lord on our own merits. I'm not going to stand for you. You're not going to stand for me. And to be honest, I know that much. You see that? That's how much I know. I'm constantly learning because I don't know anything. And that's why I had you on here, because I'm like, I want to get your perspective. I knew we would have a fiery discussion just because of reading what you had to say, but I'm willing to have you on. And I know you got to get going. You've got another interview coming up, but
Stuff.
where can people find you, by the way?
I am not really a big social media person. I don't do Facebook. I don't do all that stuff. So you can email me, or you can go to the St. Mary's Warrior Defense Project and kind of see what I'm doing there. But I'm not really into all those types of things.
I've posted a link in the description of your professorship. It has your contact information in
Sure,
there,
that'd be great. Yeah.
because I'm like, oh, that's a one and done thing versus. And then also it's is it Shotwell Publishing that
Yes, Shotwell Publishing Company puts out the book. It's on Amazon, Union Terror, and as I said, it's a very good read. Very good read, if I don't say so myself. And then this follow-on book is even a better read, Trampling Union Terror, which goes into more historical details of different campaigns and what happened.
so that one's going to cover, like you said, this how they actually did what they did
Goes
on
into
that one.
far more detail. It's about 3 times as thick as Union Terror. Far more detail. Yeah.
So how long does it take to put together a book? This,
Well,
this,
I've written over 100 books, law review articles, stuff like that. Uh, this one took about 50 years to write, on and off. The
I
Trampoline Terror
understand.
one. But yeah, it doesn't take too long. As I indicated, I'm just now finishing up an article on the Israeli-Hamas situation. And uh, yeah, so it's it takes a while because you just can't say nanny nanny poo poo just with the seven major religions. I've read them all. What attracted me to Christianity was I don't have to be good. The other religions are too hard. You got to work your way, do the moral code because all religions have the same moral code. Do the moral codes, do the rituals, and maybe you're in. I don't like them. The other one is you believe that Christ died for your sins, you're in, and you don't have to be good. It's I encourage people to be good, but it's not a requirement. I like the story of Abraham, Genesis 15:6. How was he saved? 20 years old. He's making idols in his father's garage, and he heard the gospel, which is the same as we hear. They didn't have much information, but they knew one day in time this Messiah would come and die for their sins. It says Genesis 15:6, the Lord Abraham believed in the Lord. It was
Yep,
credited to his account for righteousness.
that's right.
And then he went on to be a rotten person most of his life. He was a yellow belly. Told the Egyptians, yeah, you can have my wife. She's not that
I know,
interested.
two different times.
But yeah, I like grace because if God is love, shouldn't it be easy? Yeah, and there's nothing easier. You simply believe and you're in. With one speck of faith, more than none at all, with a hangover.
No, I
I
was
do
just
teach a
talking to,
Bible class. If anyone's interested, I do from the original language. I've been doing it for 15 years at the law school, and what does it say? I know church tradition is here, but what does it say?
yeah, I was telling my group last night that I lead that it's by grace, and we were
Yeah.
talking about it, and it was,
But there's just like so many fundamental things. If you've got another second, like
go ahead.
fundamental stuff, Christianity 101. I would ask people, a lot of people say, well, I love Jesus. Really? Let me ask you some questions about Jesus. Explain to me the hypostatic union. What are the 10 attributes of God? What happened on the cross last 3 hours, first 3 hours? Don't know, don't know, don't know, but I love Jesus. Dude, you can't love what you don't know. So on the cross, which is fundamental stuff, as you know, he was up there 6 hours, 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock. At 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock, he didn't scream out in pain. No screaming. As a sheep before the shears, the prediction in Psalm 22. And then at 12 o'clock, he started to scream at the top of his lungs. And he screamed, we know what he screamed, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is the
They could
Aramaic,
hear him.
my God, why have you forsaken me?
Hmm.
Which is the prophecy in Psalm 22, verse 1.
That's right.
You got to ask the question, why did he start screaming? Because when I hit my hand with a hammer, I use the F word right off the bat, or other words. 3 hours later, I'm not in that, the pain kind of subsides. Not so with him. He started to scream at 12 o'clock. And he just didn't do it once because in the Old Testament prophecies, it's in the plural, his screamings. And people, of course, darkness hit the face of the earth. People, the cross people were saying, well, who's he screaming for? And then at 3 o'clock, it says he stopped screaming, just stopped screaming. And he said, tetelestai,
It
which
is finished.
means it is finished, mission accomplished.
Yep.
So a lot of questions. What caused him to start screaming and why did he stop screaming? Well, what caused him to start screaming is in his own body, he bore our sins. That's when, if it's chronological, that would be our grandmother, Eve. The first sin hit his perfect humanity. Didn't deserve to die for sins of the world. He died spiritual death.
Hmm.
And so when that sin hit his perfect body, that's when he started to scream. And he screamed and screamed and screamed. Trillions and trillions and trillions of sins were slammed into his body. You and I weren't alive yet, but God knows we come into existence. All the sins we're going to do, they were bundled and slammed in. And then he said, mission accomplished when the sin bearing is over. Now, that doesn't save you, but it makes every human a candidate for salvation. All you got to do is say, I'll take it. And you're in. You don't hear that in church. And yet it's passage after passage after passage. They just say, oh, Jesus died on the cross. Okay, mechanically, what does that mean? Because he was physically alive when he suffered spiritual death. His physical death doesn't provide salvation. His spiritual death does. The penalty of sin is spiritual death. Well, what's spiritual death? Separation from God, amongst other things. But anyway, that's what I try to do. I just go in, what does it say? because the information is very liberating. Anyway, that's just a sidebar. Um, no extra charge.
Well, I also know that there was a coinciding of the slaughter of the lamb at the same time that was
Oh yeah, the
going on.
Passover was being
Passover
celebrated.
was all being all that.
And
And I
that's
was just,
ritual without reality. Because the
yeah,
ritual of the Passover indicated these things that you're saved by the sacrifice of another person. But then the idiot said, oh, we kill one lamb and get saved. We'll kill 50. It's works. They forgot ritual without reality is meaningless. They did the rituals, but it had no meaning.
no,
They did
no,
not believe in salvation by the coming Messiah.
no, no, they didn't. That's
Some
the
of them did. Joseph and uh, Joseph of Arimathea did, and Nicodemus did.
Nicodemus. They came
Yeah,
and got his thing. We were just talking about that last night. We were talking
yeah.
about John 3 and the significance of the practicing of truth and came the truth, the whole aspect of the reality of that, and that it was
You
born
know,
of water and spirit, and he's like, I want to be born twice, and he's like, no, you've already been born. When you
exactly.
amniotic, when the fluid burst and you came out, that's the first birth. The second birth is the spiritual birth, and that no, you're
Right.
not going to get, you're not going back in the womb. And Nicodemus, and he goes, but don't you should know this, and the reason why you should know it, if they were
You're a teacher of
reading,
the people. You don't know that? Yeah, exactly. He said, you don't know how to get saved. You're supposed to be, you hold yourself out to be the top of the top, and you don't even know.
because they were so corrupted by their traditions of men that
That's right.
they lost it. And unfortunately, the church has picked up a lot of doctrines and a lot of
You
creeds
got
along
that
the
right.
way that have kind of polluted the whole aspect of this grace that Paul kept screaming at the top of his lungs in all of his letters, saying, it's not by works. If you try to go back to works, you can't be saved. You have to be saved by grace. Grace, grace, grace. Don't you understand that's what Abraham was saved by belief in, and it's like that all the New Testament writers were constantly trying to remind their readers, and yet here we are 2,000 years later, still in a lot of ways having to remind people that it's not by what we do, it's what was done for us, and that we just have to lay our life before the Lord and say, take me as I am, and then like the
Well, of
song,
course,
just
the
as I
command to
am.
all of us is, I always tell people, what did Jesus do for 3 years before he went to the cross? Did he establish the Crippled Children's Foundation? No. Did he do the down with slavery movement? No. What did he do for 3 years?
He
He
proved
taught
it.
Bible doctrine to
Yep.
people. And can you imagine sitting in that Bible class for 3 years and you learn nothing?
Well,
Amazing.
even as apostles and didn't get it until they got the Holy Spirit on day of Pentecost, they were still thinking in different terms. He's like, "No, I didn't come to do what you thought."
Well, a few of them got it
Oh, of
because we
course,
know that the person that listened the most wasn't one of the disciples. It was Mary Magdalene because she saw him first. Why did she see him first? A former prostitute. Because
she
she
got it.
paid attention in Bible class.
Yes, she
That's why.
did.
The
She
other
was given
knuckleheads,
that.
they did it with one ear. It didn't even go out the other ear. It's
No, no,
amazing.
no.
That's what we're commanded to do is to learn, as you indicated, you're correct, learn the mind of Christ. And I've been invited to a lot of churches. I mean, all over the country. They find, oh, you're a law professor, you're a Christian, come teach to our church. They never have me back twice, ever, because I also teach salvation by grace, and I also teach eternal security. You can't get unsaved once you're in. They don't like that. No, don't tell the young people you can't get unsaved by they'll go out and fornicate. They're going to do it anyway. Tell them the truth. You cannot get out. That's why we call it the good news, not almost the good news. Because a lot of people think, oh, if I didn't have a head belief, a heart belief, it don't say that in the Bible. You believe with one speck of faith more than none at all, the size of a mustard seed, and you're in. You're in the family, and you can't get out. They don't like that. It offends them. Oh, no, you got to suffer, brother. No, you don't. You got to learn. That's what you're supposed to do. But yeah, they never have me back twice.
Well, I appreciate that, and yeah, I've got a lot of books on my computer. You've got yours published. Mine are sitting in my computer, ready to be finalized and get out there. But that's a great way to finish off, and I appreciate
Yep.
your message there because really, it's our faith, and I know that all of us are going to be corrected once we meet the Lord because we've all got so many things where, it says the eye is the lens, it's the lamp into our being, And I say the darkness is just our ignorance. It's our inability to grasp and take in what God really is teaching. So, but we still have the light of Christ and the Holy Spirit's in us. But when we get before the Lord, everything is going to be completely revealed and everything's going to
Heaven
be
is a
stripped
place of
away.
vast inequality.
What's that?
Vast inequality. Heaven is a place of vast inequality. It's like a pyramid. Once you believe in Christ, you're guaranteed a slot on the bottom. Very few people will be up near the top. What's it based on? How much did you learn? What did you learn? And it's not a matter of, oh, there's nobody to teach me. Yeah, there's somebody to teach you. You don't want to learn it. Most people, they don't want to learn. They're satisfied with the man-made traditions and la da 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 da. They'll be in heaven, but the rewards will be limited. And that's another doctrine, of course. But yeah, it's a place of vast inequality, but you do it to yourself. If you want to be saved, you will be saved as a human. If
Yep.
you want to reach maturity, you will. But most people don't. They don't care.
I'm I'm 100% with you, and the people at the top are going to be people you and I don't even know. That there were people who throughout the I mean, I'm doing my best to allow the mind of Christ to take me over and just
Well, there's no
get rid.
magical download, though. You've got to, there's no like,
No, you
no,
have to
you've got to
work at it.
study. You've got to find a pastor teacher that you can learn from, because you can read the Bible till you're blue in the face. You're not going to get anything out of it.
Oh
I
no,
did it
that's
twice, learned nothing. I had to find somebody that could teach me that was a genius in the original languages. That's the way it's always been. Somebody has to teach you.
yep.
You got to find a teacher that knows what they're talking about. And the Koine Greek has a lot of bad words in it. I love the Koine Greek because in the military, I wouldn't tell my men, let's precipice up, let's ambulate up that precipice. Get your butt up the hill. And that's the Koine Greek. A lot of bad words, but they won't translate the bad words. I do in my Bible
There's a
class.
lot of things that the Bible translators, and I have a brother-in-law who does that, and I have conversation. I go, why don't you just translate baptism as immersion, is what it says in the Koine Greek, is immerse. And well, I go, yeah, because there's too many denominations that sprinkle. It's simple things like that. You just realize too many individuals have too many their hands in it, and they don't want it to be pure. And
There's different interpretations of the Bible, no question about it. But I always say that, as the Lord said, my sheep hear my voice. When you hear the truth, uh, it'll have an impact if you want to hear it.
yep,
But as an educator, I can cure ignorance, but I can't cure stupid. I've been trying to cure stupid for years. Can't do it, but I can cure ignorance. Well, I know I'm out of time, and I
yeah,
appreciate you letting me drone on.
well, thank you so much. And again, I'll put your description in the description. It'll be where they can find you, and your books are at
Oh,
Shotwell
and
and
my final
Amazon.
remark, the views I expressed today do not reflect St. Mary's University School of Law. They're my own personal opinions. I always want to say that. Uh, so that's a disclaimer, a legal disclaimer. They're my own personal views. And I'm always happy to debate, because that's what lawyers do. We try to challenge people to think outside the box, look at it a different way. And I'm big on critical thinking skills.
I'm there. So, folks, I want to thank you for joining us this week. And it's, like I said, it's been over a month since I've last had a show. This has been a great one. It's got me fired up, and I really appreciate my guest Jeff and all his work. And folks, look him up. He's got a tremendous amount of books and white papers, published articles that he's done. He's a very smart man, and he's somebody that you could learn a little bit from. So I want to say thank you for joining me. Thank you, Jeff, for being here on the Lion Zone. And if you guys like what I'm doing, make sure to share the show with all your friends. And until next time, this is Steve Johan saying, be a lion and not the prey. And then stop that.